Welcome back to the further adventures of the monad. I left you in limbo last week. If you were not being chased by a ghost, you were drowning in your own fears. This is a classic representation of what death holds in store for us. It is a narrative that keeps bums on seats in church and coffers full of money for the institutions that spout this drivel. Yet, in all that is said, there is a grain of truth. In fact, there are bucketfuls of it. What is not correct, however, is that the punishment we may experience when we reach the lowest three subplanes of the emotional world is not a punishment inflicted upon us by a vengeful God, who is happy to assign us into the fiery pits of hell for all eternity. No. The truth is, we construct our own hell down here on earth, and we take our fears with us when we die into the emotional plane. It is only when we realize that what we are suffering is illusional, that we actually create for ourselves, that we are released and we fly higher into the emotional world. Where do we end up? This place has traditionally been called paradise, or the Elysian Fields, or Valhalla. You know what I'm talking about. So, what is this place? Well, we know we are still on the emotional plane. What we should also know by now, or you have not been paying attention, is that this world is a consensus environment. What does this imply? If I am Dutch, and my idea of paradise is a landscape full of windmills, this is where I'm going to find myself. I will be in a mini Holland, and it will be populated by people who, just like me, are Dutch. We all collectively have an idea of what paradise should look like, and we focus our energies on creating it out of tertiary matter found on this subplane. These windmills are not fleeting apparitions we conjure up for ourselves, although we can do this as well. These structures have a solidity that is reinforced by hosts of monads strengthening this appearance. There is a mini Holland in the emotional world, and it is populated by monads who think they are actually Dutch. The monad can spend many happy hours, days, and years bicycling around this environment. They could even meet friends and family who may themselves have pitched up here. They may actually be their friends and relatives, or they could be self-activating shells that are passing themselves off as people with who the monads wish to engage. What is relevant to know is there is no harm in thinking of yourself being Dutch or riding a bicycle. But we all know that this is not what life is about. Yes, we are talking about life. Just because you are functioning on a higher plane of matter does not mean your life has ended. Far from it. Your life is progressing to its next stage. That stage is always linked to consciousness expansion. This, alas, is not something that is going to happen on the emotional plane. It can't. There is nothing real on this plane. Remember, this is a consensus environment. We make it what it is. On this plane, there are also divas and animal monads that we may have loved and cared for. They have their own space in this environment. Let us assume that our monad has its focus slightly higher in their emotional envelope. If this is the case, the monad floats up to the next subplane 48.3. Here, being Dutch is not so important anymore. Seeing a windmill is not necessary either. You may even decide you did not really like being Dutch and may choose to adopt a new presentation of yourself, culled from another incarnation. My mother recounts a story to me that her grandfather communicated through a medium, but presented himself as a Chinese mandarin. When questioned why he was adopting this habit, rather than that of an English Edwardian gentleman, he responded that he was so ashamed of his last incarnation that he chose to present himself in a guise where he was much happier with the outcomes of that incarnation rather than the last one. It should also be noted that a monad's interest in what is going on back on Earth diminishes as they rise further into the emotional plane. They identify less and less with the persona they once were and begin to express themselves as who they really feel they are. So, in the case of my mother, were we to meet on the emotional plane, how should we introduce ourselves? Hi, I used to be your son. Hello, I vaguely remember being your mother. This brings us to another interesting point. How long do you actually spend on the emotional plane? As you saw in the diagram, there are more steps to go before you end up where you started. As a rule of thumb, a monad spends roughly 25 years on the emotional plane. Some monads get the hell out of it as soon as possible and head straight up to the mental plane. They can do this because they have nothing to process out of their lower molecular levels, and they realize where they are may look like paradise, but it does not equate to anything that remotely can be called reality. So, they realize they are wasting time and they start to dissolve their emotional bodies as fast as possible. In fact, many of these monads take great care to fully deactivate their emotional bodies, so mischievous tertiary molecules or nature spirits from the Deva kingdom don't take on this envelope and masquerade as their last persona. Bringing this back to a personal perspective, my mother passed away in 2002. Making a bold assumption that I have a fair few years to live on these three subplanes by the time I consciously get back to the emotional plane, the monad that was my mother will be long gone into the mental plane. Of course, I can fake it and conjure up a facsimile of my mother and proudly tell her that I remembered to wash behind my ears regularly. But who am I kidding? Myself, of course. That is the common currency of the emotional world. This brings me to another point about monads dwelling in the emotional world. They may have been screaming atheists back here on Earth. Now they find themselves very much alive. They desperately seek out a medium or clairvoyant to proclaim their findings to the world. As a child, I read a book called Life in the World Unseen. This was a seminal book in my early teens. It gave me a very clear picture of what I know to be the emotional world. Is this picture accurate? Of course not. But it is a good facsimile and one that is worth a read. You get a good feeling for the different subplanes even if you realize towards the end what is being described is what the author wishes to see, not what is feasible. There are other discarnate monads on the emotional plane that feel that somehow they have discovered great truth and they need to share this newfound wisdom with the rest of us. There is one underlying truth to bear in mind. You are no wiser once you pass over to this world than you were when you inhabited the one below it. You may think you are, and the souls you communicate to back here on Earth may be enraptured with your words of wisdom, but in reality, it is a case of the blind leading the dumb. When communications suddenly start being transmitted from the Intergalactic Council of the Pleiades, you are now communicating with the Dark Lodge. They are an intrepid band of black magicians who have renounced their humanity and now are forced to dwell in the emotional world. They cannot incarnate because they have severed their link to their causal bodies and their guardian angels. But they can communicate to you through a medium or clairvoyant and are happy to feast on your emotional entrails. In fact, they have to maintain themselves. The free energy that comes to all of us through the life thread has been disconnected from them. They chose to do this and now need us to feed them with our gullibilities. According to Henry Lawrence, the record for a monad staying on the emotional plane went to Queen Elizabeth I. That monad was so wrapped up with the role it played in their last incarnation that they simply could not tear themselves away from the role even in the emotional world. It took this monad 500 years to finally move their game on to the mental world. Speaking of the mental world, that is where we're heading in the next presentation. Thank you.